Welcome to Brandon Hall Group's HCMx Radio, the only podcast in the HCM arena that weaves current market research, HR technology, and industry leaders into each episode. Our HCMx Radio host is our Chief Operating Officer and Principal HCM Analyst, Rachel Cook.
Hi, I'm Rachel Cook, the COO of Brandon Hall Group and the host of our HCMx Radio podcast. Welcome everyone today. I'm excited to have with me Nikki Eatchel, the Chief Learning Officer from Mursion. Hi, Nikki. How are you?
I'm good, Rachel. Hi. Thank you for having me.
It's great to have you here today. And so we're going to be talking about DEI competencies and practicing social and EQ skills with virtual reality. In particular, some of the solutions that you have at Mursion that have been very effective and successful. And we're going to talk a bit about the research too and some of your insights here. Before we dive into our topic today, Nikki, can you share a little bit about your background, some of your hobbies, your passions, so our listeners today can get to know you a little bit better?
Sure. So as you noted, I'm the Chief Learning Officer for Mursion. My background is really measurement and assessment and learning analytics. So being able to evaluate sort of proof of learning, proof of growth, and make sure that we can provide really strong information back to learners around sort of skill attainment and growth paths, and do the same for organizations as well. And most of my career has actually been spent for about the last 25 years on what I think most people would consider the hard skill assessment. So sort of knowledge and skill application in both education, but employment, like medical specialty exams, different things like that, where you've got to show knowledge, but you often also have to show practical skill. So in the medical profession, maybe a clinical assessment, and more other areas, maybe like a crane operator has to show the skill that they can actually operate the crane, those sorts of things. And actually now coming over to Mursion is super exciting because it's being able to apply those same principles around measurement and learning paths and really learning analytics to other types of skills, which I won't call them soft skills because I think they're really foundational to really every human interaction and success. So I wouldn't, you want your foundation to be strong. So I won't call them soft skills, but really critical skills to strong human interaction. And sort of success, right, in various areas of both work and life. So that's really exciting for me. From a personal perspective, I tend to be a person who focuses a lot during the day on process and numbers and analytics. And when I'm not doing that, I think my creative outlet is cooking and, reading and then, sort of making sure that I've got life moving forward for the three children that I have in both high school and college. So that keeps life pretty busy.
We have one that's a senior that is getting prepared, looking at colleges now. So it's a little bit of a stressful time. It'll be nice to know where he decides to go. And we also have a 14-year-old in high school and an 8-year-old daughter, so 2 boys and a girl. And so yeah, we haven't gotten to college yet, but that's, I'm sure, another exciting chapter.
You've got a good span there, so that's helpful too. You get to have a lot of different phases that you're working through.
Yeah, we're a blended family, but all of them live with us full time, so it's nice. They get along great. But
That's
there's
wonderful.
there's never a dull moment.
There usually isn't, right?
Yes, I'm getting more and more gray. I think because they say children keep you young. I'm not sure. It's a little bit of both.
Yes, agreed.
And Mursion, going back to your background and the development of hard skills versus soft skills, and what's really nice about Mursion is that you have these environments, these virtual environments where you give this safe platform to be able to exercise and to be able to develop and hone in on those key skills. So, Mursion has done a really good job in doing so. And let's talk a little bit about the research that you did linking EQ skills with leadership and DEI competencies. What are some of the takeaways from that?
Yeah, and as I said, my background's not, I'm neither a DE&I expert, certainly, nor an EQ expert, but what I'm helping Mursion do, and a lot of the great work that they're focused on, is taking a lot of that great research that is out there, both about EQ and about DE&I capabilities, and really the intersection between the two, and apply that great research in the best ways to help learners practice those skills. And so, when you look at, I think it'd be kind of hard pressed to argue at this point with the decades of research around the criticality of emotional intelligence and those EQ skills in an organization. We've all seen tons of the research on that, and it creates, better job satisfaction, customer loyalty, profitability, revenue, all those great things. In evaluating a lot of that research, one of the things I also thought was somewhat interesting that doesn't necessarily get always the same focus is the Harvard Business Review came out with the EI Advantage. And in that, they looked at organizations and they referred to some of them as perceptive organizations. So those organizations where a significant portion of employees would say that the organization focuses largely on EI and EQ competencies. And those perceptive organizations certainly had a lot of those benefits that you see in a lot of the research, but also particularly were more innovative organizations because of the collaboration and open conversations, the contributions of different perspectives, and in the end, the tolerance for risk because of those sort of emotionally intelligent approaches to the work. And I found that to be just really fascinating. And when you combine that with a lot of the great DE&I research, which there's about a decade of really good, strong research in that area too about the advantages. The intersection between those two is what I find, and Mursion has really been focused on as a really, I think, powerful connection. There's a great book out there called Emotional Intelligence for Managing Results in a Diverse World. And there's 3 authors on that one. It's a great book, and they really focus on you can't really drive DE&I competencies if you don't have strong emotional intelligence, which is because they note in the book, it's because we all deal with people, right, who every day we have a barrage of people we're interacting with that have a lot of differences from us on many dimensions. And that really evokes emotions when you're in front of people and you're dealing with differences in any way, shape, or form. And having the capability to handle those emotions with self-awareness and self-regulation and control and openness and empathy really is critical to driving diversity, equity, and inclusion goals. And that's really the critical piece from our perspective that's been so interesting about the research and what we're now applying to the activities we do at Mursion. So if you look at what our clients have been doing, both in general leadership and diversity, equity, and inclusion, it's all about practicing those human skills. And when you break down the scenarios that they're looking for to the skills that are being practiced, they're all those EQ skills, right? Active listening, adaptability, conflict management, empathy, patience. And so what we've been driving towards is mapping those skills and then tracking that to skill practice and skill growth, both in EQ skills, but then also then in the subsequent DE&I competencies. So it's been just really fascinating work to be included in with Mursion.
That's great. And it's, we see in our research how important when we look at organizations that are performing better or that have cultures that are more collaborative, their leaders are able to build trust, and they're able to, and by doing so, is being able to have, the ability to, as you mentioned, some of those competencies to be apathetic, to be, to emphasize and to be compassionate and understanding, and self-reflection is so important. No one's perfect, but to be authentic and to also be aware of how you may come across or the perceptions. And, if you do say something or you do misinterpret something, and you're not even aware of it, but just having the ability to own up to it, or to be able to, if your team or your whomever that you're interacting with, if they trust you, they know that it's not coming from a bad place, that it's, perhaps a misunderstanding or just something, the lack of awareness on an issue or a topic, because there are so many issues and topics coming up in different cultures and different, where a lot of most organizations are global organizations. So you just can't possibly understand, every different type of cultural nuances, let's say in South America and in Asia and in Europe. You just, it's not possible for one human being to be aware,
Right.
but to have the ability to be, self-aware of how you embrace the differences is critical.
Yeah,
So,
and I think
that.
even, oh, sorry.
Oh, no, no, no.
I was just going to agree with you. Yes, and I think even being aware and recognizing, right, that we can't possibly, right? We all have different lived experiences. We all have bias, right? It's not if we have bias, it's which biases we have, and that's not a bad thing to say. It's to call it out and recognize it. And I think even just to be open enough and self-aware enough to know, of course, I can't possibly, understand everything, and to lead with that curiosity and seek other perspectives, as opposed to be defensive or assume that if you don't understand every perspective, you're somehow lacking, I think is a big shift in difference, and I think really helpful within any environment.
I think that's also what makes a lot of conversations rich when you are, connecting and meeting with different people from different places around the world, and you're asking them questions. Every time I do, I learn something new that that I find fascinating. So I think that, and others do as well. And then, then sharing that in more ways or more different types of scenarios. And my next question here is how, or describe your process and how you create valid and authentic DEI scenarios.
Well, as you can imagine, it's not an easy process. Any kind of scenario where you want to have an authentic conversation, even if it wasn't in what are very nuanced and sensitive areas like diversity, equity, and inclusion, like even just a general conversation would require, a significant amount of sort of development and review. Once you hit areas like diversity, equity, and inclusion, where you want to ensure what we're doing is creating a positive experience for learners, a positive experience for organizations, and even for our staff, that in order to do that, there's a lot of complexity and nuance there. So how we look at it is really, you've got to have all the right expertise at the table, which really means kind of three different types of expertise. We certainly want to have measurement and assessment and analytics expertise, because we want to ensure what we say, what skills we say we're offering to practice, and the information we provide to learners about that is accurate and is appropriate and helps sort of drive that positive change. We certainly need to have subject matter expertise. So as I noted, I'm not a DE&I expert. So certainly you need to have experts in diversity, equity, and inclusion at the table to help determine what's being developed, how it's being developed, and how it's being deployed. And then we certainly also need what I would refer to as simulation expertise. Not all sort of interactions or scenarios are all going to be best suited for a simulation environment. And so understanding the best way to design that in a simulation setting, and also to have the valuable feedback from our internal experts around what likely responses you could get from learners around that, so we can understand that ahead of time, I think is really critical. So those three areas of expertise are just absolutely critical throughout the process. You've got to sort of establish up front what is that library of content you really should be focused on, from DEI objectives and content and skills. For our perspective, the skills are really are critical for us, because that's what we offer to practice. And we really want to focus on those skills that have shown to be improvable with practice. And so those are things we check and evaluate with our DEI experts. Once you create a draft scenario, again, running it through all three of those areas of expertise is really important. And then ensuring that you've got the right perspectives, depending on the kind of DE&I scenario. You can have panels of DE&I experts, but again, they also have just their own lived experiences. So for example, if you're going to create a scenario that involves individuals who are non-binary, like as you're creating a scenario around that, you want to make sure you have those perspectives around the table. Because it is a sensitive sort of topic, and you want to make sure that, again, you're providing that scenario in a sensitive, helpful, and productive manner. So sort of walking through all that, I think, is really critical. When you get to the point where you have sort of reviewed and approved internally and externally scenario content, it's also important to test it out and to see what kind of reactions you're going to get from learners, because even if all of our DE&I experts agree, and our simulation specialists agree, and our designers and measurement personnel agree that it's a good scenario, you could end up getting reactions with learners that you didn't anticipate. So having sort of some of that live check and evaluation, I think, is really critical. And then frankly, in the end, it's nonstop, right? You don't create a scenario and you're done. You've got to continue to evaluate sort of learner response, our simulation specialist response, and those sorts of things to adjust and evolve as you go, especially in a sensitive and changing area like diversity, equity, and inclusion.
And so these scenarios, would you say, are developing their both their DEI competencies and their EQ skills going
Yeah,
through
and
this?
yes, in those scenarios, and they cover a variety of content, but in those scenarios at the core, what we identify in each of them is the skills that each learner is going to have the opportunity to practice. So those are EQ skills like active listening, right? There are other skills like adaptability, conflict management, but there's other components too, empathy, openness. And what we're doing with those is tracking those skills along with the accomplishment of the objectives in the DEI competencies, right? So, for example, if the goal of the scenario is to identify and interrupt a microaggression, certainly the skills by which you're going to be able to do that are those EQ skills. The success of the outcome is really around those DE&I competencies. So it's that combination together that we think really drives the most change from a learner perspective.
Okay, interesting. Yeah, I couldn't agree more. It's, that continuous practicing of the different scenarios and situations, and especially what is relevant, but sometimes you're not even sure what is relevant maybe today, but it could be applied, a year from now, depending on the situation. And I think being able to be prepared, as best as you can for different circumstances only makes you a better leader, or a better team member. You can contribute, more productively. Can you also provide some examples of the scenarios and results from learners who practiced and reflected on their EQ skills?
Sure. I mentioned one, like, for example, as we've got a library of content, when you think about DE&I, there's some general areas that clients certainly like to focus on around microaggressions, implicit bias. It may be fair and equitable hiring discussions. So a scenario in which, a number of people are discussing potential hires and you want to make sure you're identifying any implicit bias and redirecting conversation and asking good open questions. There's others around allyship. So there's certainly a lot of different types of scenarios that all get to sort of the broad competencies and skills of DE&I. I think really just from a respecting learner privacy perspective, what I think I could talk about sort of one of the things that was most impactful to me as an ongoing DE&I learner. I've gone through a lot, certainly, of scenarios and observed a lot of them at Mursion as well. And I'm certainly involved in the design process. So all of those discussions have been phenomenal for my own personal growth as a professional and as a leader and in my own DEI competencies. And I would say one of the scenarios that was most impactful to me, both in watching it evolve in the development process, but also in hearing learner feedback and having my own reactions to it as well, was one really in relationship to allyship, but really around decentering, right, the ally in the conversation. So there's a scenario that we have where the learner has to react to an employee who has come to work, a Black male employee who has been pulled over by a police officer on the way to work and who's been traumatized, by that experience. And as a white woman, right, going, I don't have the same lived experience. I can't, I can empathize, but I can't really sympathize, right, with what it's like to be in that situation when I don't have that same lived experience. So I think one of the things that I inherently learned, which I thought was so valuable through being exposed to that one, was there is a natural human tendency to want to make it better, right? So I want to make you feel better. I want to be helpful. What can I do? Which is a nice response, but not the most helpful response, right? And what that does, it puts me in the center of the discussion of what can I do? And in essence, subconsciously, potentially even to make myself feel better, right? Like I want to feel like I helped you. I want to, make the situation better. When in reality, the better reaction to that is to take a step back and find what is going to be most helpful for the person in the conversation, which in reality may not be to talk about it. It may be that they don't want to be involved in a conversation right then. It may be they want space to go away from me as the learner and have a moment to themselves, or to call their spouse. and understanding that that's not going to feel good to me. I'm not going to get resolution. I'm not going to get to feel like a helpful person, but that's not what matters in the conversation. It doesn't matter what's going to be helpful to me. It matters what's going to be helpful, to the other person in the conversation. And that's an important lesson, as well as I'm not going to feel resolved at the end of the conversation. I don't get to wrap it up in a little bow and feel like, oh, I did a good thing, or we got through this difficult conversation and now I'm a good ally, I can move on. Learning that you have to live with, that's not what's going to be helpful to that person. I don't get resolution, but what I do get to do is hear what they need and be respectful of that. To me, that was a very impactful scenario to be exposed to hear a learner reaction, and to have my own reaction to, as a person going through that process.
That's a great example. And I don't know if it's also a gender perception or normalization, because I think as women, we want to be able to empathize, and we want to, the minute you kind of start talking about that situation, I'm trying to think back to, okay, when was I pulled over? How did I feel? Can I relate? And so, nobody wants to be pulled over, right? It's not a good experience, but it's a different experience for certain. And, so it's interesting. I think, as women, not all, I can't speak on, it's more of a generalization, that, oftentimes in certain difficult situations, we want to be the peacemaker, the fixer. We want to be able to, make it better, put a Band-Aid on it. So I think that's something that, in this particular scenario, being aware that that may not be the best way to respond. You're not everyone's mom. You can't make it right. And even so, you can't even make it right all the time with your own children. They have to learn. So it's interesting. Good. That's a great example. My last question before we wrap up for today, and looking forward, looking at what if we can fast forward 10 years from today, what are some of the advice or recommendations that you can offer leaders and organizations, and what they can do to help their workforce and their teams, with DE&I?
Yeah, I'm like I said, a measurement person. We all have our biases and our filters that we look through life in, and being a measurement and analytics person, kind of look at it, pretty objectively, which is, for me, it's sort of three phases. It's planning, it's practice, and it's performance, like performance measurement. So the planning is really critical, right? We see companies spend so much time, right, with strategic planning and managing how they're going to hit their revenues and their profit margins and their growth. And not nearly as many companies put that amount of planning into their DE&I programs, and how they're going to increase their diversity, and more importantly, their inclusion even within their organization. So I think the planning is really critical, and the planning has to include measurements of success, right? Like, how are we going to measure if we're making progress or if we're falling off track, and how do we hold people accountable to those measures? So I think the planning is really critical. Obviously, I'm a big proponent of practice, right? And getting knowledge around DE&I concepts and strategies is certainly helpful, but unless you have the capability to practice, and practice in the right way, you're not going to have significant impact. And I think that's probably why we've not seen DEI programs be as successful as we would like them to. And as we said, it's important to have the right kind of practice, right? Which is not, in a safe place. I mean, a safe place is a good place, but I should say not in my comfort zone is a better way to say that. If I'm just walking through a conversation and it's a pretty comfortable conversation, and I'm not being stretched, right, to address something uncomfortable, or stretched to utilize strategies maybe I haven't done in the past, then it'll be a nice conversation, but I'm not going to learn much from it, right? And the other side is, if I'm in a danger zone, if sometimes we see like role playing things happen out in front of groups and things like that, where you feel like, well, this is dangerous, I'm just going to kind of do what I think should be done so that I don't get any negative feedback, I can't possibly fail in public. Those sorts of things, I think that's a danger zone. So we want neither comfort zone or danger zone, we want growth zone. And so that growth zone is having that environment where you can practice strategies and push yourself beyond your comfort zone without that fear of failure, or fear of harming somebody else in the conversation, or yourself from going down a wrong path. So I think the practice component is really critical, and it's the ongoing practice. I think in particular, the importance of practice with this kind of a skill is you've got that fight or flight reflex, right? When you get in an uncomfortable situation, you either avoid it in a work setting or potentially get very defensive. And the whole concept of practice gets you to recognize that first set of emotions and move beyond it. My husband works with a wonderful person called Dr. Kathy Kindem. They're in the education industry. And she has a phrase she uses, which I feel like is the epitome of emotional intelligence, which is my first thought does not have to be my last thought. So, as I head into a conversation and somebody says something that makes me uncomfortable, and maybe my first thought is, ooh, I want to avoid this conversation. If I recognize that and get to my second thought, which is, oh, I should be more curious about this and find out more information and see what I can do to learn more or be helpful, that's how we get better practiced at that being sort of our much more automatic response, which is hard to do without ongoing and consistent practice. So the planning, the practice is critical, and then the performance management, right? Which is you can't manage what you don't measure. So how are we measuring our progress? How are we keeping track of that? And how are we adjusting as needed? And I think if we do those three things, and organizations focus on those three things, we could see much different environments, 10 years from now.
Absolutely. Those are three great ending points: planning, practice, and measurement. And I, that really aligns with our research and our certification and practice also around DE&I. It really is complementary to what you do, where I feel that your scenarios really dive into kind of the practice of it, and where we help is kind of understanding how it integrates with their other HCM and integrated into their overall talent management and objectives of the business. So, I love the fact that you really stress the measurement, and I think it's really important to think about it in the very beginning of whatever it is. And that's why we see a lot in our research over the years that diversity training is not effective, but it's what most companies do or start with. It's either diversity training or some type of coaching and mentoring or ERG group. And those are good, but on its own, they don't really have a lot of longevity if it's really not integrating and continuing it over and over again. It's not just, okay, we have some issues here and really need to figure it out, and then we'll just, give them some kind of diversity training. It's really not understanding what, you're not really aligning it to the business objectives. And if you don't do that, then yes, in the past, we saw a lot of companies do it because they have to. It's check the box. We have to offer some kind of ethics training or diversity training, but then they wonder, it's just not the metrics piece or the data is not aligning with what they hope to accomplish as far as engagement and performance and improving culture and all of the above. So I think that was really good advice, those 3 points you made, and sharing all of your perspectives today was very interesting and helpful. I love the scenario that you gave around we just can't fix everything, but we have to listen, and we need to be able to at least respond in a way that the other person feels heard, and they have options of where they can go, what they can do in that moment, or whatever's needed.
Yeah, I think the listening component, right, is something we could all get better at in general. And again, taking yourself out of the center, which is always, again, sort of, I think, a natural human inclination, which is where you get back into, like, the more you can practice taking yourself out of the center, I think the more natural and muscle memory that becomes of, like, oh, this is not about me. And how do I learn more? How do I help more? How do I learn different perspectives? And that sort of component of it, I think, is really what's going to drive us forward in a much better direction in the future.
It's a great way to end. Thank you, Nikki. Thanks for joining. Thanks for sharing all of your expertise. And thank you all for listening in. Have a great afternoon or a great rest of your day. Stay healthy, productive, and until next time. Thank you.
Thanks, Rachel.